Singularity. My name is Nikola, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoy this podcast, you can help me make it better in a couple of ways. Number one is you can go to iTunes and write a brief review for the show. Or number two is you can simply go to interviewthefuture.com and become a patron. My guest today is Nikolas Badminton. Nick is the Chief Futurist at futurist.com. He has worked with over 300 organizations in foresight, strategy, and disruption, including NASA, the United Nations, Google, Microsoft, Intel, Rolls-Royce, and many others. Nick is a friend of mine, and in addition to our common interest in the future, we share a few other passions, such as cycling and certain types of music and books. Now, speaking of books, however, Badminton's new book, Facing Our Futures, this fantastic book, Facing Our Futures, is currently a hot new release on Amazon. So I highly recommend you guys go and check it out, because during our conversations today, we're going to talk about the present, the future, the big trends in general, but also about many of the lessons and the tools that Nick has for us in his fantastic new book, Facing Our Futures. So, welcome to Singularity FM, Nick.
It's a real pleasure to be here. In fact, I'm sort of pinching myself. I've been watching you and the interviews you've been doing over the years, Nick. So this is a real pleasure for me to be here, and it's always good to chat with you.
Fantastic. Yeah, last time we were chatting, we were bicycling actually along the lakeshore, which was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
This time is kind of on the record. So, Nick, if you had to introduce yourself in one sentence to our viewers and listeners, for people who may have never heard of you before, who is Nikolas Badminton in one sentence?
I'm a recovering management consultant, advertising executive. I'm a person that's lived in data for over 25 years, and I've been working in futures and futures design, futures exploration, and creative intent to really try and work out what's coming next for the last 10 or so years. I can add to that. I'm a biohacker. I've been playing around with lots of different ideas of spec futures for a long time, running events and doing some really cool stuff. And you came to speak at the last Dark Futures event in Toronto as well. So, there's lots of things I like to play with. I know that's longer than a sentence, but sometimes I've got too much to say.
Well, I'm going to shorten it up in a sentence, and I'm going to use your own words, actually, from page 15 in your own book, because I actually like it, and I think it actually captures you well. So you say, today, I'm a dreamer, futurist, a foresight practitioner, and a hope engineer. I really like that, a hope engineer. Another term I interlace with futurist. So what is a futurist, Nick?
I mean, a futurist is someone that kind of urges the world to be curious about what comes next, shifting that mindset from what is, looking at what's happening today to what if, what might be, in 10, 20, 30, 50 plus years. So a futurist can look at societal and cultural trends. They can look at technological trends. They can look at the big macro systems of the world, of the industrial complex that we're stuck in. They can look at the minutiae within organizations and within technical systems as well. Like I said, we're hope engineers. We're trying to wake people up from their poverty of imagination to really ignite, some attempt at daydreaming about what might come next. Because imagination and creativity is a lost skill within the context of organizations and governmental planning.
Wow, imagination, creativity. And you talk about, maybe now I should ask you, because I like how you put it in your book in one place when you're talking about the present poverty of our imagination. Tell me more about that.
This is something I first heard from my friend Lo Stamhoff, who's the chair of futures over at UNESCO. So we're born as kids, and when we're going through childhood, we've got an abundance of imagination. We play together, we create all sorts of scenarios. When I was a kid, we played Star Wars, or we played Asterix, or whatever. We imagined ourselves as these characters. That hill over there wasn't just a hill; it was a fort, or it was something that we had to play on. And then when you get to sort of adulthood, we sort of get burdened with taxes and life and having kids and paying the rent and a whole bunch of different things, and suddenly everything gets very serious, and we don't wake up imagining how life could be different, or asking what if. And that sort of led us to this collective imagination sort of deficit. In a way, it just means that within organizational context, we think inside the box, we operate inside the box, and whenever we kind of come up with a crazy idea, we're kind of told to shut up and move forward and stick to the plan, right? So what I try and do in my futures work is try and really sort of blow the doors off of all of that and say, okay, here's lots to see and lots to consider about how the world is changing. What if the world was different for your organization? Like, fundamentally, if you don't change, you end up in stasis. And if you end up in stasis, you end up in a long, slow decline to obsolescence and eventual death. And that's taken from an earnings call that Jeff Bezos had as well, right? So imagination is hugely important to really, dial that up. And I think as futurists, whether it's a keynote or a workshop or writing or doing podcasts, it's to invite people to really wake up and say, okay, let's be curious, let's have fun, let's not discount anything, and let's try and imagine how life can be different.
Yeah, and I really love that, because you are also saying somewhere in your book that imagination is a superpower. And I remember when I was a kid, as you were saying, the kitchen chair could suddenly become the Millennium Falcon or something like
Right.
that, and nothing was impossible, really. And then you become adult, and one day everything suddenly becomes impossible, and nothing is really possible, only like the harsh reality or something like that. And so in that case, in that sense, I totally love that you're saying in your book that imagination is a superpower, because it allows you to break through kind of the prison of your own mind. And unfortunately, that's something that I struggle with on a daily basis, to get out of my own kind of established ways of thinking. And
Yeah.
it's a really hard thing to develop and to sustain.
Yeah, it's interesting. You said, last year when we went cycling, and I had all sorts of punctures, problems, and whatever, and you helped me with that. It's interesting. I always remember a little story about a doctor, a very, very sort of wizened, surgeon, expert, global knowledge around surgery. I can't remember which discipline exactly. And every day he rides 17 minutes to work. And in this very sort of grown-up interview, it's like, oh, you turned up, you cycled to the interview, like they were surprised. He goes, when I cycle, I'm 7 years old again, and I look at the world completely differently, and it makes me realize that I'm human and that there's fun in the world. And just even that, or doing yoga, or painting, or I don't know, just wandering in nature or whatever, tries to really sort of reignite some of that passion that we had when we were a kid, and that wonder. When do we ever look back, look at the clouds and wonder what happens? I mean, maybe this is why psychedelics have come into modern society again, to try and liberate people from depression, or try and blow people's minds wide open to rethink, the design of technologies or society as a whole, right? We're just trying to work out how to reignite that. And I applaud that in people, but there's so many people, in fact, the majority of the populace, that just don't look up and even consider, what's happening out in the wider world, and to take a deep breath and realize that that's a really important part of the day.
Yeah, as a funny story, I think Albert Einstein came up with his theory of relativity while riding on his bicycle. And it
Right.
was kind of in the middle of the night, or after dark anyway. And he was looking at his headlight as he was biking along his path somewhere in Switzerland, and was thinking, what would it be like if instead of a bicycle, he was riding on a beam of light? And how would
Right.
the speed of light of coming from his headlight compare to the speed that he's riding his bicycle at? And what would the time differential be, and how one is relative to the other, and all those incredible things. So I totally kind of congratulate you on those 50 rules, I think, or lessons that you learned for your 50th birthday, which, by the way, happy birthday. You had a big anniversary
Thank you.
recently. And I
Yeah,
think,
last year, yeah.
I forget if it was number 21 or which one was it, but one of them was ride a bicycle.
That's right. Like, go outside, play. I've got a 2.5-year-old son. Play with your son. It's one of the most liberating experiences now that he's kind of like chatting and kind of being mayhem. It's one of the most liberating experiences that's just really fulfilling, something that I've been missing, not only in my life, but my work as well, a perspective, but also a simplicity of thought, and a sort of that childhood exuberance and and innocence. And I think that goes alongside imagination, like exuberance, innocent passion, just not having a care in the world. And I think that we have to be better at operating like that as a whole. Whether we're in organizations or whether we're in governments or whether we're just going about our daily lives.
Yeah, I don't know if it was Einstein, but reputedly it was him who said that imagination is more important than intelligence. I don't know if
Right,
that's an accurate credit to him or not, but I think there's a lot to it. There's a lot to it, and especially when it comes to the field of futurism, which you
right,
talk a lot about in your book here. So
yeah,
let's go back on topic here a little bit, and let me ask you this kind
yeah.
of a still um, uh, kind of a different question. Is there a difference between a futurist and futurism and foresight professional?
So, futurism is the discipline. Some call it futurology, some call it futures design, or I call it a mix of everything. In fact, I sort of switch and chop and change in the book. Apologies for people that are sort of getting confused by that. But generally, I say futures design and foresight. Futurism is the discipline, or futurology is the discipline. A futurist is just someone that undertakes that work. And we see a broad perspective of different flavors of futurists in the world. Pop futurists that sort of, they're very sort of wide perspective and not very deep in knowledge, but kind of imagine that, there's exponential change. And we see people like Peter Diamandis or whatever out there. And it's slightly cringy, but it's very inspirational for people that are just beginning the game. And then you've got really deep thinkers and people like Ray Kurzweil and whatever that have got very deep in terms of thinking, but the very sort of structural, science-based, prediction-based sort of futures and futures thinking and futurists as well. I try and just be a more sort of creative discipline in the middle of everything, to try and learn about signals and speculate on trends and try and write and try and get people excited, try and tell stories about things happening today and how they're likely to have a bearing on our futures, to work with people to try and create complex ideas around the interplay, lots of Venn diagrams of the interplay of like 3 different signals that become different trends and got different effects, and a number of different things as well. And sometimes my approach is more simplistic than maybe academic futurists, which sort of go down the rabbit hole of more complex ideas of multiple states of futures, multiple possibilities and plausible futures, preposterous futures, whatever. So I try and sort of swim in the sea with everyone. Right. I would say that I started off as a bit more like pop futurist, but that very quickly faded about 8 years ago into something a little bit more serious. Now, when I work with clients, it's sort of strategy, but straddling into foresight, and that foresight and the exploration we do there, trying to be useful back to the strategic planning today.
So I guess you don't differentiate between futurist and foresight professionals the way that John Smart does in his book Introduction to Foresight. And by the way, John Smart is probably one of the most kind of formal foresight professionals. He works for the U.S. Navy most of the time, my understanding is,
Right.
or the Department of Navy of the United States. And he talks about the difference being, in his view anyway, that futurists are a lot more story centered and story oriented, whereas foresight professionals are a lot more fact based, and maybe from there, foresight professionals are a lot more quantitative oriented. They do quantitative analysis, whereas
Right.
futurists are a lot more qualitative, and are more focused on kind of telling stories, painting those pictures, whereas the foresight professionals are a lot more about the specifics and especially the closer future, maybe. So if
Yeah, and this is the idea of forecasting versus foresight, and super forecasting, which is another flavor. I'll be honest. So I run a Discord for futurists around the world, and it's got some of the greatest thinkers in there that I used to be connected to on Twitter, and then we all sort of had a mass exodus. And we're in this forum, and we have this conversation a lot about quantitative and qualitative, like foresight and futures, and no one can really agree. But there seems to be a consensus that it is about the signal scanning, but it's very much a creative art. So I think that if you come from, say, quite a formal forecasting background, and it's something with military, maybe it's Navy, maybe it's the Army, maybe it's in R&D, it can kind of feel like foresight is more quantitative, and it's more about distinct signals, combinations, nearer futures 5 to 15 years. But I generally don't take things as seriously, and maybe that irks some people. I think the book might irk some people because I sort of swim in the waters and just try and find my own way so that I can explain it to clients in a way that they can understand it. Because I've seen foresight professionals in a room with CEOs, and just look at the futures cone. There's like 6 different flavors of futures. It's just so complicated that we have to kind of, I think, simplify it down and just say, hey, let's just like sit up, pay attention, get creative, and play with this a little bit more. And that's why in my book I don't really go into too many frameworks. I sort of talk about the things that I kind of find interesting, from like Jim Dator at University of Hawaii, Manoa, the things that I find from Joseph Voros and what came before him with, the futures cone, but taking ideas of preposterous futures and whatever. I'm sort of very particular because I found that they've resonated with executives more than anything else.
Yeah. So for the purposes of our conversation here today, I just wanted to get this out of the way, that basically a futurist and a foresight professional, you kind of use as synonyms. So they're
Yeah.
not in any way distinct or opposite, the way, for example, John Smart and others say, and that's your flavor, and that's perfectly okay, because as you say,
Yeah.
there's a big debate about that there. But let me ask you
Yeah,
this
for
then:
sure.
what's the biggest misconception about futurism in your view?
When I'm out and I meet people, I'm out at dinner and I know that I'm going to be introduced to people, by friends, I just say that I'm a marketing professional, and that avoids a whole bunch of conversations. But when I do say that, oh, I'm a futurist, it always starts with like, oh, so what about predictions? What do you predict for this? What do you predict for that? What do you predict for, a number of different things? And the fact is, we don't do any kind of predictions. Earlier in my career, I'd predict things that would happen within 3 years about mobile computing or whatever. Horribly wrong. And you sort of learn these lessons, and you sort of lick your wounds and pick yourself up, and then realize that futures work is about speculation. And I use the term what if, and I use the term from what is to what if, which I lifted from Rob Hopkins' fantastic book of the same name, which talks about creativity and activism, to really say that, okay, this is about us being curious and stepping up and speculating on what comes next. It also means that when you're at a conference, you're not going to have someone standing up at question time and saying, hey, everything you just said is absolutely incorrect, all your predictions are wrong, because that's actually a very easy thing to say. If someone says, I don't believe what you just said, you can say, yeah, but what if the world changes? And I also say to people, it's like, just add the word yet to the end of every sentence that you just said. And it's like, oh, well, the full automation of farming is definitely not going to happen yet. It really pacifies the conversation and opens it up. And it was about 3 or 4 years ago that I started to change the way that I spoke about futures, because you'd hit these very hard-nosed people that just didn't believe what was being said, and it was very like prescriptive. This is going to change and that's going to change. Welcome to the future. Goodbye. And it would leave people without a route to have a conversation. Whereas saying, what if and speculating and sort of creating, fun, imaginative scenarios.
Yeah, I have to say,
We're just playing with ideas.
I have to say, I like your flavor a lot, where you actually make the distinction between forecasting and futurism, and so
Yeah.
I guess for you, and I'm more on your side a little bit here with respect to our conversation and the flavor I like personally, anyway, as opposed to John Smart, to say that forecasting, which he would call formally strategic foresight, forecasting
Yeah.
is a lot more quantitative and specific, and has got attached specific timelines and outcomes and this and that and the other. But futurism is a lot more speculative, and we shouldn't lie about that, and we shouldn't hide it. And you're very frank at putting it straight up and forward to be very clear about this. Uh, and it's a lot more, again, to what we started our conversation today with, which is our imagination and what if and what might be and how things may turn out, and then so what are the implications of all of that. And so I personally have always kind of gravitated towards your flavor of futurism than John. But again, I don't have his kind of hard scientific background like he did, and maybe I'm not so quantitative anyway. So I'm not a big fan of statistics and charts and all those things, which are, I guess, inevitable part of your daily work when you work for the Department of Navy, per se.
Yeah. I mean, I still take into consideration forecasts. I still look at quantitative data. I still look at, people that are saying, over the next 10 years, according to all of these assumptions and these conditions, that we could potentially see, growth like this or decline like that or whatever, and percentage points. And I do use them in my work. I absolutely do. But I think we end up with something that's a little bit more useful when we start thinking about people and places and dynamics, cultural change. I often talk about the feelings of our future. How does it feel? And like when we write stories, how does that future feel? And once you can place yourself in a story mentally and the way that your brain works, you start to empathize deeply with the dynamics. And that's why we use storytelling so much with the clients that we work with, because you suddenly can place yourself in that position and tell story. There's an entire chapter of the book that never made it. And it was a piece of fiction that I wrote about San Francisco in the year 2087, about the company Organization X, that I talk about in the book as sort of a made up company that I'm using for my scenario sort of outlines in the book. And that sort of talks about a young girl called Jocasta living and thriving, surviving, having dynamics with different people, some biohacking, some solar punk sort of movements, activism in the streets of San Francisco. And I think that's what forecasting is missing, and that's fine. But at the same time, I haven't read John Smart and what he does. When you actually look at wargaming and things that are used in military contexts, it's very much about telling stories as well. I mean, there's a fantastic futurist here in Toronto called Carl Schrader, and he writes books. And he wrote a book for the Canadian military. There's literally a novel, design fiction. It's fantastic, and I really love that sort of it hugely inspires me.
Yeah, it's called something like Crisis in Zephyr or something like that.
That's right,
Yeah.
Crisis in Zephyr. Yeah, and you can download that off the internet for free, for sure.
Yeah, it's public domain, because that's what they paid him basically to produce the book and make it available online for everyone. I've had Carl a couple of times on my podcast, and he's had great impact, by the way, on my career and my trajectory and my understanding of the singularity. He was the guy who basically put the nail in the coffin on the singular future coffin many years ago, when you told me, I like the singularity, but the singularity is like a lens, and I like having other lenses in my toolkit. So then I put it down, and I put on another lens, and it gives me a totally new perspective of the world. And doing this over and over again ends up producing a better, richer vision of the future and the possible futures. And that to me, uh, probably, I don't know if it was 2013, 2014, 10 years ago, was a big light bulb moment, because up until that moment,
Right.
I was basically more or less a Singularity fanboy.
Yeah, for sure. Me too. I'd bought into it. I don't think there was the amount of information out there. There weren't as many people sort of foresight, speculating about what's coming and being creative. And yeah, we were looking to the Kurzweilian idea of singularity. And I met Ray Kurzweil about 8 years ago. You can't doubt that this is exciting stuff, and these are good big ideas that are provocative. But when you start to peel off the layers and you start to realize that there's lots of different paths forward, then I think it gets really interesting. I sort of went through a stage in my life where I had existential crises as I started thinking about, artificial intelligence systems and surveillance and data capture and social media networks and intelligence organizations around the world and the dynamics. And you sort of get to the point where you feel that you know too much and you're sort of sat on a couch in a dark room at 5 a.m. wondering, can you carry on to do this work? And you sort of have sort of levity and rise out of that and realize that, okay, this is the situation, this is the world, but there's a huge amount of human potential, and there's a huge amount of like cultural hijacking of all of these horrible icky systems out in the world that we can actually affect. And I always say that futurism is activism, and I think that that's a really important part of this as well. And that sort of liberated me from being a huge fanboy of the poster people of futures work, and sort of trying to find the more interesting people that live in the shadows. And I was always into like the cyberpunks and Bruce Sterling and William Gibson. Seeing these people speak just really blew the doors off. It's like Kurzweil and William Gibson in a room together. I'd love to see that, because it would just be two people like butting heads like stags.
I would place all my money on Gibson any part of the day. And it's again
Exactly.
because of that
Wildly smart.
imagination. He's got, if anyone has incredible imagination, it's got to be Gibson. Now, Kurzweil may be
Incredible.
a brilliant guy, brilliant inventor, and kind of a very nice guy. I did an interview in person with him in his office many years ago. And he was like the most humble and generous kind of people that I've ever met. But I would place my bet on Gibson any day, all my money entirely on him. But let me ask you this though, because that kind of brings us, we've had a kind of a similar path a little bit here with respect to the singularity and specifically what we might end up calling the singular future. What's wrong with the singular future? And you even touch a little bit about it in your book when you touch upon the so-called California ideology. And I would say perhaps the epitome of that would be Peter Diamandis's book, Bold, The Future is Better Than You Think.
Yeah.
So what's wrong with that idea that, hey guys, the future is better than you think?
So so the Californian ideology was a really fantastic article that was written and published on the internet and put out there in the world, which is like profit and money and technological progress at any cost, sell everything to anyone. It's kind of it's a little bit strange and greedy and very Silicon Valley. If you've spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley, it's not really changed its spots in the last sort of 25 years. It's still like relentless. We'll take funding from anyone, we'll sell to anyone, growth at any cost, exponentials, yada yada yada, right? The singular future is something that people like Mark Zuckerberg and even Bill Gates, to where way back in the day, and Steve Ballmer, it's like, buy this product, use this, fit into this box, operate in this way in your life, and suddenly I'm like you, you're like me, I'm like my family, everyone's sort of confined to these, ways of working. And we sort of call that technological colonization in a way. We can only like a post, and then suddenly you've got 5 different options, but there are only really 5 different possibilities. But the real difference is that you and me, we've got completely different trajectories in life. We've got completely different, thoughts and feelings, cultural reference points. We've got different hopes and dreams. We want to be in different places. We've got different kinds of relationships. And all of the people that we touch have got different futures as well. So that's why we have to really imagine the plurality of our futures. That's why when I was naming the book and I was working with my publisher, it was like, oh, we're going to call it Facing Our Future. And it's like, no, you have to call it Facing Our Futures. And it's a distinction that I have to teach everyone, that there's a plurality. Every person in the room has got a different future ahead of us. And ultimately, whatever decision you make today creates an infinite number of possibilities. So if you think about the complexity of that and the world, when we're thinking about policy or creating technological systems, or we're trying to write a story to connect with as many people as possible, we kind of have to create some breathing space to allow an opportunity for someone to self-actualize within those platforms or through the story and their interpretation or whatever. Technology finds it really hard to have multiple futures because they're literally putting you in a box and giving you a manual and saying you work that way. But within that container, you can operate different ways, and you can basically. I think content creation is one of the most interesting things. Like, YouTube works with a set of functionality, but the content that you publish to YouTube can be absolutely anything that you want, within guidelines and decency, right? So that's futures within a future state of technology, right? So it gets really interesting when you think about that. But yeah, this is all about being aware that anything can change, and any people can really have an influence on your life, and you can have an influence on them. And ultimately, the infinite complexity is something that we revel in futures work, but it's also the most tricky thing to work out. Whether you're a fossil fuels company trying to consider renewable energy, a complete disruption to your business, and how 10 different kinds of people are going to basically consume your product. The archetypes of advertising are almost over today. You can't have, I worked with a large telecoms company in Canada, and they were like, okay, our target audience is a white man and a white wife, and he's got a son and a daughter, and the daughter's a little bit older, and the wife makes the purchase decision. And I sat in the room with a client, and I said, you realize that there are single parents, there are queer parents, there are people without kids, there are, kids that are 18, 19 years old that don't have parents. There's all of these flavors. There's different machinations in groups. You've got co-housing and co-living. So you're even talking about groups. And then they were like, no, but we can't think about that because they've got a poverty of imagination, going back to that, right, Nick? So it's sort of what I'm saying is a long-winded way of like, you have to think about multiple futures, plural, because we're all different and we've got that infinite possibility when we all come together.
Yeah, I love that. The futures in your title. I love that. I didn't fail to notice that it's futures plural, and I love that precisely because after my conversation with Carl Schroeder, and before that, by the way, the other singularity skeptic that blew my mind was Charlie Strauss, who wrote Accelerando, and yet he himself turns out to be a big singularity skeptic for similar reasons. But basically, I got to the conclusion that the multiplicity is always going to be better than the singularity, because the singularity smacks too much of that kind of California ideology, which suffers from what I would call technological determinism, suffers from lack of flexibility, suffers from teleological kind of unidirectional, unitrajectory kind of inevitability to it, and therefore destroys our ability to imagine alternative futures, which leaves us impoverished in our imagination, but also impoverished in our reality, as you would say.
Yeah, absolutely correct. I mean, and this is what politicians do. It's what leadership around the world does. It's what people that run the companies that we work for and the platforms that we sign up to. It's what everyone wants because it's easier. and it's controllable and totalitarian from a technological perspective, right? But we know that humans are beautiful and expressive and wildly different. There's a bit of a revolution right now in terms of humanity. People can express their sexuality, they can express their thoughts and their feelings, whether they're really extreme left or extreme right. We're sort of in this big melting pot and this soup in the world, and I think it's more vibrant. I mean, there's a lot more conflict and it's a lot more difficult, but this is the way that humanity's been, for the whole of time. But I like to think that there are communities of dynamicism that are actually going to have more of an effect on thinking about progressive policy, progressive technological platforms, and expressions of ourselves, in a digital sense as well as in a real world offline sense as well.
So, Nick, we've been chatting now for a little while, so it's time to start perhaps refocusing our attention a little bit more to your book.
Sure.
Even though I have to say that so far we've been kind of touching on many, or if not most, of the themes that you
Right.
already go into much into depth in here. But before we do that, let me just ask you, why futurism, man? You started with kind of an admission or a confession, maybe even I should call it, that you're a recovering marketing executive. So
Yeah.
perhaps you should start by giving us a little more about your why, the story of why and how you kind of ended up as a futurist, if in your previous life or previous professional life anyway, you were in marketing.
Well, yeah. So I was a management consultant. I was a technical architect. I ended up in advertising when I moved to Canada in 2008, and I was in strategy. So I was really trying to work out what was coming next. I started to play around with new technologies like 3D printing, cryptocurrencies in the early days like Bitcoin, and just sort of encouraging clients to sort of take a leap in terms of trying out new and funky things. And what kind of switched was a great friend of mine. Moved from Germany to Vancouver, where I was living. I hadn't seen him for a few years, but we'd grown up together, and we're basically best friends. And he's in futures as well, but he builds very progressive, headsets and a whole bunch of different stuff in R&D labs, and went on to do futures. It got to the point that in 2012, me and him, we drove down to Portland, Oregon. We went to a little unconference called Cyborg Camp. It was being run by Amber Case. And Amber Case is an incredible thinker about thinking about digital culture, cyborg anthropology, calm technology, and a number of different things. Great friend of mine. And we went there, and at this unconference at lunchtime, I said, can I bring this to Vancouver? I kind of want to run a conference like this. I'm curious. And I really got ignited to start, questioning a number of different things. So the following year, got out my credit card. 150 people flew from all over the world to turn up. Amber Case was a bit of a rock star right back then. She'd done a big TED talk and whatever. So me and a number of people, we spoke and we got people together. And there were incredible people in the audience like Chris Dancy and some people that I highly respect. And it sort of ignited this idea of futures. But it started off with, the future of humanity and technology. And then the following year, it sort of bled out into education and government, doing some speculative futures work with people like Afshin Mayan, that does works with Elon Musk and a number of other people at Neuralink now on designing their systems, and it sort of rolled along. I started writing a lot of sort of more provocative pieces in the Huffington Post and Forbes. I eventually got to a point where I was working for a software company based out of Australia, and it was a gig platform company, and they were like, "Are you a futurist? You're doing all this stuff, or are you our regional director?" And I was like, "Well, I think it's time to move on." And I sort of leapt into doing the future speaking and doing a lot more TV and radio, and that sort of really ignited everything. And I call myself recovering ad exec and management consultant, because those are jobs where you're literally told what to do. You have to literally smile and shake the hands of clients and say that everything's going to be okay. And what I realized was, as I started working with clients, it's okay for things to feel tough and to be challenged, and for CEOs to be sat there and for me to say, no, actually, there's a lot of work that we need to do. And there's some things that are going to come to you over the next sort of 30 to 50 years that are going to fundamentally change your business, and you're not ready. So I kind of say that I'm hired for the things I used to get fired for. Right. It's kind of interesting. So that's why I say I think I'm kind of recovered. I think I've recovered from being an ad exec, and I learned so much good stuff from being a management consultant. I got to work with some fantastic people and companies. But yeah, now we've got an honest conversation in life, and there's no looking back. I'm kind of unemployable by normal companies, but I can be hired, and the teams that I bring together are hired to be in the room, to be different, to challenge people, and so that people suddenly walk out of the room with a little bit of a broader perspective on the world. And I've literally had people walk out of lectures and workshops, quit their jobs, and gone back to university to do a different kind of like master's degree to change their focus in life. I've also had like legal professionals that run practices that have changed entire practices after seeing some of the things I was speaking about, and having conversations with me, because the landscape was changing, and they realized that there was a huge opportunity. There was one down in Detroit, and he suddenly changed his focus towards electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles. And now he's got this amazing legal practice that was about 4 or 5 years ahead of everyone else in starting to talk about that. So it's kind of hugely exciting to me.
Good for you, Nick. I'm very proud for what you've done, because most ad executive or marketing people would never actually dare to do that kind of a jump into the unknown of the future and start creating it. And that kind of connects with your other kind of slogan. It was also, you mentioned it already, but it was also one of your 50 things for your 50th birthday, and that was that Futurism is
Yeah.
activism. I'm a big fan of that, and
Yeah.
the best place to start doing that is always in our life, obviously.
Right.
But
Exactly.
even though most people miss that point entirely, and it's always about from an advice point of view, you should do this and you should do that, but they don't do it themselves. And I always say we have to all live our message, otherwise it doesn't work, because it doesn't matter what we say unless we live it. So let me ask you this then. Let's start from the big picture and then zoom
Yeah.
down and see if, how, and where your book fits in it. Because you're a guy who looks at signals and trends and how things may turn out 5, 10, 20, 30, 50 years from now. So what are the big
Yeah.
what are the interesting signals that you've been monitoring for the last decade? What are the big trends that we should, that all of us should pay attention to or be aware of? And perhaps most importantly, what do they tell us, and how do they compound to create the biggest challenges or problems that our civilization is facing today, in your view?
So if you'd go back like 8, 10 years ago, I was very much focused on the growth of data, the application of artificial intelligence. In fact, I studied artificial intelligence at university. It was very sort of rudimentary back in the 90s, but following the trajectory of that and the growth and the effect and the sort of the ability to really change the world through insight and through automation, I was really focused on that. In more recent years and over time, as I got to work with people that worked in the natural resources industries, to work with the United Nations, amazing people like Yusuf Nassif, the director of adaptation at the United Nations Framework for Climate Change Conference, I then started realizing that, sure, it's okay to look at the systems and the sensors and genetic engine, all this good stuff, and I still do that. But really, the things that excite me now is getting into the details behind global dynamics around the water energy food nexus, and how water scarcity is affecting energy generation, how renewable energy is sort of overtaking fossil fuel investment and generation and changing dynamics, how things like agriculture and food production at scale is struggling, but sort of really been the thing that's helped grow GDP in society and country and population and culture in a way, right? So I look at those three. It's the nexus of the water, energy, food nexus. I also consider waste very carefully. When you start to realize that the mass of all plastic waste in the world today is twice the mass of all mammals in the world. So we've got a huge amount of waste. We literally bury it underground and say that, and every day waste is a cultural artifact of our industrial revolutions, right? So they're the things. They're the big mega trends. I love looking at population growth. I love looking at dynamics and changes and the dynamics of economic changes where you're going to have China and India becoming like the top two economic powers in the world, with the US relegated to number 3, how like places like Lagos, Nigeria in Africa is going to be 55 million people by 2050, or 88 million people by 2100, a new breed of megacity, and the dynamics that can come from that. And how do we feed these people? How do we keep them hydrated? How can we keep the lights on in these places? That's the thing. And I'm all in on that. And it's why I focus most of the examples in my book around those elements. And all of the keynotes and presentations and workshops I do, it's all got those as a basis of understanding those dynamics before we get to anything else in the world, because nothing else is going to exist without working out a good, sustainable way for those three to interoperate and for us to be able to thrive in the world.
Well, what about those like Mr. Elon, who would tell us that, the biggest challenge that humanity is facing today is AI, and it's bigger than nukes, and it's kind of like calling the demon from those horror movies, etc., etc.
Right.
Aren't you, and shouldn't you, as a futurist who looks at tech and AI and all of those things, share that concern? Do you agree? Do you disagree? How do you see that?
Yeah, for sure. So, so I graduated in 1996. In 1997, I went for a job interview, and the job interview was in defense as a computer programmer. And the interview I went for was to use Lisp, which is a really old artificial intelligence platform. Really, really rudimentary. It's still being used in a lot of different places. Probably still being used in the applications that I was interviewed for, to program the guidance systems for Polaris missiles. Now, I sat there and I was like, okay, this is cool in one way because the application and playing with all this like well-funded stack of technology, but at the same time, I'm not going to help people kill people. So thank you very much. I'm going to walk out into a different world and try something else. So I've understood though those ethical dilemmas and the challenges of things like artificially intelligent systems and the campaign to stop killer robots and no Sharky and all those people behind that over the past few years. I understand that very, very carefully. People like Elon Musk and anyone in Silicon Valley or anyone that's tech centric, obviously they're going to say that something technological is the biggest challenge in the world. And it's like, oh yeah, and now look at my investment portfolio in OpenAI and all these other areas and how we can solve that. And hey, it's that techno savior sort of complex. A buddy of mine, Tom Goodwin, that's quite well known online, he says that the man that sells purple paint is going to want to paint the world purple. So it's like something like Elon Musk saying that AI is the greatest problem. And it's like, and then you look at his investment portfolio and how he actually makes money from solving that problem. It's fine, right? Again, it's a very narrow state of thinking, right? I think about over and above water, energy. I think about mental health, multi-generational trauma, things that are a little bit more difficult to pin down and work out, and things that have got a deeper, more societal challenge to us than worrying if an artificial intelligence system is going to be autonomous enough to, I don't know, take the job away from a taxi driver, or take the job away from someone that's going to press a button to fire off a missile, because those kinds of activities are something that are going to be undertaken, and they're still fueled by a human in the background. They're just not the people pressing the buttons or driving the vehicles. They're just the decision makers that say, go and do that and do as I say, right? There's still the human and the machine in the mix. So by its very nature of Elon Musk saying that AI is our greatest threat, it's actually humans are our greatest threat. So yeah, it's cyclical, and you've got to unpack it a little bit more.
So let me ask you this then. You have the world of Elon Musk, which, who actually, I should say, commands much more the public attention than any of us
Sure.
probably ever will, uh,
Sure.
due to his platform, due to his followership, etc., for whatever reasons. And so people, the average people, are seeing his predictions and his warnings about AI on the one hand. On the other hand, they're
Sure.
watching the news with the war in Ukraine. And on the third hand, me and you, who are kind of professional keynote speakers and futurists, are talking about futures. And my question to you, as a newly published, hot commodity on Amazon Books, where does your book fit within that kind of a world for the average person, perhaps? And what can people gain from getting your book, reading it? How does it fit into this world that we're talking about?
So one thing I wanted to do when I sat down to write the book, it came from an idea. It came from a short essay that I did in another book called "The Future Starts Now," which was edited by Theo Priestley and Bronwyn Williams. And it was all about start with dystopia, the idea of thinking about dystopic thinking to fuel decision making, because it broadens our perspectives away from like everything's going to be okay. I wanted to write a book that not only explored that idea, but a book that introduced people to what futures thinking is. So it's almost a little bit simplistic, and I've shared it with other people around the world, and some people are like, well, it's not really, exciting in the way that I thought it'd be. And it's like, no, but this is for the executive that's starting from no idea around thinking about futures, or people in ad companies or people in government that have been sort of focused on 4-yearly cycles and haven't really looked up and considered how big the world can be. So it's kind of like a primer. It's certainly not like the only futures book that you need to have in your library. When I write books and when I read books as well, I like to have a reference. I can read 5 or 10 pages and it's useful, and then I can leave it alone and I can come back to it. So that's kind of how I've written it. I mean, it's a little bit conversational, it's a little bit introspective, but I've tried to put tools in there that are kind of useful, or reference points or stories that are kind of just going to help us like shift our mindset a little bit as well. So, I mean, that's what the book is all about, is really just priming that, plus introducing some of the methods that I use as well. And even the idea around futures consciousness and changing our mindset to be open to new ideas. I've just tried to really highlight amazing thinkers that are out there that have done incredible research reports that need to be shared. So this isn't like a completely unique piece of work from me. It's like a perspective, and it's shining a light on probably like 24 people that have done incredible work and need to be sort of recognized, and we can dive into their work a little deeper and then apply that in different ways.
So, in other words, what's the change you'd like to make with your book? Or, in other words, maybe another way of saying that would be, what's the impact? How would you measure your success of your book? What do you want to accomplish? What do you fight for? What do you fight against?
Yeah. So I was in this time last year, I flew down to Scottsdale, Arizona. I spoke at a conference. It was my first in-person conference since the pandemic went down. It was everyone was vaccinated and tested. Everyone was wearing masks, and these are like the presidents of Pepsi and other people like that. And one of the other speakers was a great guy called Paul Polman, who was very kind to give me an endorsement, ex-CEO of Unilever. And now he works for an organization called Imagine, and starting to really, really, motivate people to be more sustainable and think about that. And he did a study and he shared this with us, and he said, long term, in the context of a modern organization in the US, in terms of long-term package for recognition of results, is about 1.3 years. So what I want to do with my book, I know it's crazy, absolutely insane. There are no CEOs. There's certainly no CEOs in the West. I don't think that I can imagine that have got like 50-year horizons or 100-year horizons and think beyond, them existing today.
Maybe Von Chouinard is the only person that comes to my mind.
Right. I mean, you've got Masayoshi Son from SoftBank, who's got a 300-year strategy. You've got people from, Kyocera, the CEO over there. He's got a whole new way of thinking. He's almost like a Buddhist monk sort of approach to things as well. But, what I want, Nick, is for people to read my book and to look out a little further, even if it's 5 to 10 years, and have an idea of what comes next. And a couple of years ago, I was working with a great friend of mine in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and he's got a startup. And he saw me speak, and he goes, "There's something to this futures work." And I've just got this platform, and it was for the management of human resources, like janitors and the such like. And he goes, I want to explore, future horizons. I was like, okay. It's like, what's the vision of your company in 5 years' time? He was like, I don't really have one. I just want to get acquired. And it's like, okay. So we started at ground zero, and we went through and we did some workshops. In fact, some of that work, and it was paid for by the Nova Scotian government, which is fantastic. We went through, we did the work, and suddenly now they've got a vision for 20 plus years. They understand their role in the world and their impact that they can have in the long run. They can understand, the roles of community and technology and dynamics of business better than they have ever had. Following the work, they restructured their board. They got rid of some of the people that were sort of, the older way of working and the people that weren't being progressive. They brought in new people. They restructured things. They came up with new ideas of products and new ways of consumer engagement based on futures thinking. And that company is growing faster than it ever did before. And the perspective of this individual, this CEO, is so much bigger. And when I see that, I think that there's an incredible opportunity for any organization to do this. I'm working with a very large global engineering company, and they're fully embracing the idea of scenario planning and thinking different about, what new business lines that they can create, how they can get into things that are clearly going to be a huge impact in the world that they're not playing a part in. And that's really interesting. There's still a challenge in terms of being rewarded for long-term performance, and maybe we don't get rewarded for something that happens in 50 years' time that you sowed the seed of today, and maybe that's okay, right?
So in a way, what you're saying is you have a specific experience, specific evidence that futurism
Yeah,
can give meaning and purpose to
yeah,
businesses and organizations, and kind of
yeah,
motivate them to get themselves to rearrange and reorganize and refocus and restructure themselves together in a new way, and point in a new direction they never even realized was available before.
yeah. And start to treat consumers like humans and start to treat employees like humans. I did a keynote a few years ago, and it was an engineering company. They built huge infrastructure, billions of dollars of projects. I was like, when was the last time you actually told some of your executives that you actually truly loved them? And it shook this guy so hard. I sat down with him afterwards and we had a drink. It's like, we don't talk about emotions in our business. We're an engineering company. I'm like, have you thought about maybe there's value in talking about emotions and hope? And honestly, like we've kind of, this is the world that we've created. It's like, perform, deliver, you know, a consumer is an end point to a transaction. And it's different when we start to humanize things, and that's what I think. The idea of hope engineering, or the idea of humanizing the world that we operate in from a business perspective, is going to be the game changer for everyone, and that's what people are really waking up to, and that's a huge part of the work that I do.
Yeah, I can kind of associate with that from my experience with the Danish Engineering Society, who are one of my favorite repeat clients, actually, in Copenhagen. In Denmark, I think basically all engineers are kind of brought under this umbrella of it's kind of like a union for all engineers, and they're paying monthly fees. It's a fantastic organization, and just like most other
Mm,
Scandinavian things, they're kind of very out of the box, but yet highly engineering oriented. So when I went and started talking about some of those same things that you're talking about, originally they were looking at me a little different, and then we had this whole conversation about AI and how actually it's the people behind the AI, that the buck stops there at the people, not at the AI, because the AI is being created by people. So therefore, it's not about the
that's right.
artificial part of AI, but about the intelligence part. And so far, at least, the intelligence part is not the artificial part, but it's us, one way or another, directly as the creators or indirectly as the data providers and the bias providers and the goal providers and all of those things. And so I had to fight off, like you do, this kind of attitude that technology is going to save us. And my answer was like, technology never saved anyone. It's people who created the technology who saved us, and they created it for a reason, and they had a motivation, and they had this desire to make a difference, to save people, to help us. And so it all starts with the person. The technology is just the means. And so we had to get over that kind of an engineering bias.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and again, engineering is incredible discipline,
Sure,
and hats off to engineers that
sure.
are out there. But they're the people that have to work within the constraints of physics and understanding materials, like architects as well, understanding how everything can work. Um, you can't be creative and sort of pie in the sky and sort of floating around like some of the futurist work that I do and design a bridge that's going to hold up to basically last for 50 years and not collapse when a truck drives over it, right? So there are roles and there are means and there are ways and whatever, but there's still, I think, it's still really interesting and important to understand the dynamics of who we are as humans within the mix of things as well.
Nick, one of the tools, sort of the, if I can say, proprietary tools that you offer in your book,
Yeah.
is kind of the positive dystopian framework. Can you perhaps
Yeah.
break that down for us and tell us, first of all, is that not an oxymoron, positive dystopian at the same time? And secondly, uh, yeah, how do we use it? What is it? Why is it useful?
Yeah. When I was writing the book, I already had a framework that I was using and trying to work out, how we can travel through two different trajectories through a number of different analyses we do with signals and identifying trends, but then trying to work out the positive and dystopian effects. A positive effect is progress and equality and all the good stuff, right? And dystopian effects is like greed and reduce usage or colonized technology coming in to the scheme of things. The positive dystopian framework really just allows us to do some pretty standard futures work. So set out principles, look at the signals and trends, ask what if, do some scenario analysis, maybe tell some stories, and then sort of pass it through filters of organizational change and cultural differences, political systems, environmental challenges, and whatever, and then sort of project what might happen over the next sort of 3 or 4 different horizons, 10, 20, 30, 50 plus years. So the framework that I put together has got a slightly different flavor, that you can take a group of signals, and it might be about energy and water and food, and you can mash them together and you can do analysis. Now, a lot of traditional futures work is very much focused on positivity, and that's fine. It's like, okay, what good can come from this? Let's think about a positive trajectory. But I very soon realized that if we didn't consider how bad it can be with bad decisions that have historically happened, the last 300 years of the industrial revolutions that went before us have literally been a litany of decisions focused on more dystopian principles around greed and control and very sort of closed systems. If we don't do that in futures work, then we're ignoring the opportunity to see how bad it can get, what risks can exist in our future, and how we can actually tell that story. So the positive dystopian framework is sort of being provocative in its name, but it's just saying that there's two sides to this coin. We have to be holistic. And when we do this work, you have to realize that we might come up with a situation that's not necessarily making us feel comfortable, because something that's a possible future has actually got some terrible effects on, how we live, or equality or equity and whatever. And we have to be careful with that. What we're seeing in the world is this short-sighted thinking. Politicians stand up and say, okay, small nuclear reactors, that's going to be our future. And, in the prairies in Canada. And it's like, well, you're saying that because you found huge uranium deposits in northern Saskatchewan. Basically, we've got something like small nuclear reactors, which is based on an old model of pumping gas, refining that, burning it for energy, and then having waste, right? Even though there's a huge debate about nuclear that we probably won't get into here, and so that's a hugely dystopian perspective, because in 30 years' time, you end up with expensive infrastructure that's potentially going to be stranded assets, replaced by things like renewable energy, with nuclear waste more abundant than ever before, and a huge amount of jobs lost because suddenly we bet on the wrong horse. Whereas what we should be doing now is saying, okay, let's look at all of the renewable energy sources, and let's look at fossil fuels, and let's look at nuclear. Let's look at all of them in a larger scenario, and let's put them through this framework and see where we end up. And very quickly, you see the things that are going to be good for humanity divide themselves into sort of the positive trajectories and what they deliver as being good for humanity, and the things that are causing pollution, that are dangerous jobs and very sort of expensive infrastructure to maintain, sort of very much disappear into sort of the dystopian trajectory as well. And just looking across, you can start to see the dynamics of a country, even if you look at enough signals. So that's what I'm trying to do with this. Again, I haven't found something out there that does this exactly. And the clients that I've worked with have had a lot of aha moments, realizing that suddenly, we can make different decisions and suddenly get ourselves into a bad situation. But we've now got the foresight to understand that, beyond the four-year election cycle, in 25 years, that there's going to be something that we have to take care of. So if we have honest conversations about that today, and we have to go and get more money to invest in something that's maybe a little bit more expensive or more experimental and whatever, at least we can start those activities today. And I think that it just makes things a little bit easier from a conversation perspective. But obviously, when you present the idea of scenarios and stories and speculations, people can still say, well, that's nice, but it's, it's just futures work, right? It's speculative. But then it comes back to what if the world does change? And it's interesting. I was chatting to a fossil fuel company 2 days ago, and I don't really work with fossil fuel companies unless they want to imagine a world without what they do today, and they can imagine themselves to be providing energy in a renewable way. And I'm not talking about clean gas, which is just insane. But when you sit down and you start writing down what if questions, and it's like, what if in 30 years' time, no one's going to buy your product, your company doesn't exist? Then executives start to really step up. And that's a dystopian situation for their company, right? But on the positive side, they've got the capital to be able to invest in renewable sources and dial that side up of their business and suddenly change the world and be the good guys for once, right?
Yeah, I think psychologically we're very much motivated by the negative, by the aversion to things that we don't want to let happen. So I can see how your argument makes total sense to me, that high level executives would be very much motivated by the dystopian future. Now, many of them may not want to hear it. Like, for example, I was
Right.
sort of being pitched by my agent to do a chicken producers conference in South America. The South American, I don't know, chicken producers were getting together in maybe Chile, it was,
Yeah.
I forget. Anyway, and so we were pitching kind of like an out of the box potential for me to go be their keynote speaker, and I told him, look, I'm going to be straight up with you guys. I've been a vegan now for 8 years. So you
Right.
may not want to hear one word that I want to say, and neither may your members. However, I believe that there could be a lot of good uh, kind of information and future possibilities for you to consider, looking at it
Right.
from the other point of view, a view that maybe you don't consider very often, in your business. And I think that
Right.
can only make you stronger in the long run, even though it may be annoying and irritating, but it can actually be very rewarding if you consider it seriously. Unfortunately, uh, they they
Yeah.
so they didn't want to proceed with it ultimately, but that was their choice.
They're just, yeah, this is the confirmation bias,
Yeah.
right? We raise chickens. We're always going to raise chickens. We're going to do it in a way that's safer and cleaner and maybe more sustainable. And maybe that's going to lead to us making some more money down the road. But we're always going to raise chickens. And I was in Savannah, Georgia last week speaking to farmers, and some of them raise chickens and pigs and whatever. And I spoke about plant-based protein, and I spoke about cellular protein grown in bioreactors. And you kind of have to put it in their own terms in a way and say that you're going to be disrupted. But disruption doesn't necessarily mean replacement. Over time, it could do. Over a long period of time, it totally could do. So you might not actually raise pigs. You might actually just have bioreactors where you've got some prize pigs. You take some cells from them. They're nicely retired, and you can basically grow a completely renewable source of pig protein,
Petri dish bacon.
pork protein. Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting. You sort of talk about this, and they're like, oh, this is a fad, and that is a fad, and is it like computers were a fad, cars were a fad, bikes were a fad, everything was a fad at some point, right? But then I said, okay, so the possibility in sort of 2050, they're saying, this is my quantitative stuff coming in, $7.5 billion market of protein, animal protein by 2050. Just take 1% of that. That's a $750 billion market. And it's like, do you not want to be part of a $750 billion market? It's just 1% of your business. So you can just diversify. You can help these people do better. And then it sort of changes the conversation in a way. I've had many conversations like you just had, and people are like, yeah, we're not going to go with you because, suddenly this isn't really going to like
What they thought,
because,
that's kind of the conversation between what the client wants and what the client needs, because that client
right,
thought that they want someone to talk to them about automating chicken coops, right? Robotizing
right.
egg production, the chicken processing, and all of that. So that's fine. That's okay.
Yeah,
That's futurism for them, right? Tell us how we're going to get
sure.
robots to do our chicken farms and process like that. That's kind of their idea. So that's what the client wants.
Right.
But I believe that the client needs a bigger picture than that. Not that
Yeah,
narrow
for sure.
automatization kind of a view, but even the bigger picture that there may be shifts, that there may be undercurrents that undermine and make you obsolete completely, right? But
Right.
so we have to struggle, you and me, with like what the client wants from us and actually us trying to give them what we believe they actually need.
I use the Trojan horse sort of approach, and I will talk about the role of data and automation and all these things, and then I'll start talking about growing human organs in pig human chimeras, and what do you do with the carcass of this like human pig bacon, and then I start talking about growing protein in bioreactors and how regulations are changing, and people like Tony Seba are saying that the beef industry is going to be bankrupt in the US by 2030, deflecting to make them look, just so they've got this broader picture. So I sort of Trojan horse into the situation. But at the same time, Nick, like with you as a vegan, right? I still won't step into a room with people that don't want to hear something that I'm passionate about. And I'm not, for example, I'm not going to sit in a room to tell the oil industry how to pump more oil or the gas industry to sell more gas. I'm just not. I'm never going to do that. I'm going to talk to them about what comes next and what comes beyond their business. Because I just wrote an email to a client today, and I was like, "You're not going to be here in 30 years' time, because the dynamics today are showing us that your business is going to become obsolete. So what are you going to do? We want to work with you, but are you ready to work with us, right?"
And that's again coming back to that recurring theme that we've touched on several times, that futurism is activism, because it is not
That's right.
just the possible future or the plausible future, as when we were talking with Glenn Heemstra, who is one of your colleagues at futurist.com,
Yeah.
but about the preferable future, right? And so we have to be clear and distinct about all of those possibilities, so that ultimately we can make the right decisions and steer us towards the preferable futures rather than the plausible futures. And that's another thing that I think is important for us to, and we're both kind of beating that drum against the California ideology, and in general, but also I would claim Peter Diamandis in particular, because there is that presumption there that things are going to turn out for the best on their own accord.
Yeah.
That, you see, the future is better than you think, so don't worry about it, right?
Yeah.
I would say no. The future, first of all, there is no such thing as the future. Second of all, it's not better or worse, but it is whatever we make it by
Right.
doing something about it. And therefore, activism is crucial one way or another. So if you're passive, maybe it's going to be one outcome. If you're active and proactive, it's going to be maybe a different outcome. And therefore, we should activate people and mobilize people. So I'm totally with you on that. And I applaud you for
Yeah.
doing this with your clients. And I know you've had to pay the price a couple of times too, by the way. You mentioned in the book.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like the doors are shut. The doors are shut. You're not invited anymore. People stand up. I think I shared the story about there's a time I was in Alberta and I spoke to 800 farmers, massive conference. I love speaking to people in the agricultural world. It's really fantastic. And I did this keynote, was talking about climate change and warming, and talking about more extreme weather conditions and talking about automation, a whole bunch of different things. Fundamentally, things that are going to change their industry. I never talk about weather with a farmer. I just don't do that anymore. But I do talk about climate, and it's an easier conversation today because we're seeing things change so drastically, and we're seeing failures to hit targets like on a yearly basis now. But this guy stood up and he was like, "Everything that you just said was bullshit." And I was like, "Whoa!" 800 people, right? So I'm looking out on the stage. I was like, "Oh, why?" "Well, some of this data here and that data there and this, and you're saying that, and I don't believe." I said, "Well, you're kind of right. I've considered this very carefully, and I've really sat down and I've tried to." And then he just started to unravel like all of the tropes of like, you didn't talk about nuclear energy. And I said, "Well, I don't particularly find it to be a safe form of energy." And it's like, and sort of gets people ruffled up, and you start to talk about automation that gets people ruffled up. Start to talk about global warming. The amount of farmers that hate Greta Thunberg for standing up to the system, I can't even begin to count the number of times. Every time I go to a conference, and it's like, you're scared of a 19-year-old young woman that's standing up to rights and calling out people that aren't doing anything. You're afraid of that. Like, what? There's a deeper journey within yourself when we talk about that. But yeah, you do, and you find this, and suddenly you've got all these people chuckling, and the memes start flying at you, and all these mad sort of graphs of climate change that and and strange conspiracy theories hit you on Twitter. And that was the tough moment that I seemed to mention earlier, where I sort of switched from welcome to the future to let's shift our mindset from what is to what if. And I could have shut the guy down. It's like, what if the world changed? After that, after the Q&A, and there's some really good questions as well, I went down, I met the guy, and I said, "Give me your email. I'm going to send me your questions." And I sent him lots of reference points. I said, "This is about analysis. This is the broad perspective I have." After about an email or two backwards, nothing, just gone, disappeared. Didn't want to engage, didn't want to change his mind and whatever. But then what's really interesting, Nick, later on, I had an interview and a podcast with Real Agriculture, and I was chatting to Sean Haney and some of the people. And that guy was from a wheat growers association. And that year in Alberta, they'd had probably the worst harvest due to floods.
Yeah.
And they were literally like wounded animals, licking their wounds, looking at someone to tell them that the world's going to get better by implementing all of these new changes. And meanwhile, their businesses are almost going bankrupt, right? So that's a really important lesson in this situation as well. So it's tough, but like even these companies that we see as maybe legacy companies with energy or food or whatever that are going to have to change. There are dynamics within them that you have to uncover. You have to have those conversations. You have to understand.
One of the things that you make kind of clear here, I think, at least indirectly, if not directly, is that you really have a couple of, sort of attitudes towards the future. And one is like, okay, I can choose to fight to retain the past or bring back the past. And that's really kind of an uphill battle. And the further away you go from the present into the future, the more uphill and tougher it will be to restrain any change from happening, because change is always a constant, right, in any system. And so the better choice is, okay, what's the kind of change I'm willing to embrace? How could I shift the present change towards that kind of change? And how could I learn to benefit rather than being hurt from it? And maybe reposition myself in a way that benefits me rather than destroys me. Right. So those are the kinds of choices that we have. And I think that stands true for us as individuals and also and professionals, but also collectively as corporations, as organizations, and even at the sort of a civilization level. So Nick, let me ask you here. You also finish. You have very detailed kind of a framework that has almost, I think, 10 steps, if I remember. And
that's right.
The first 8 steps were kind of the more traditional approach, and the last 2 steps were kind of like the icing on the cake, in a way, if you will. And they were called backcasting and futurist consciousness. Talk to me a little bit more about understanding what is backcasting first, and secondly, what is futurist consciousness.
So the backcasting piece is sort of steps 9 and 10 of the framework I've got laid out, which is the backcasting strategic planning. Because I truly believe that we can do this exploration of futures, but it can't just live as this exploration. It's going to have some indications that things are going to change. So you sort of you use a process of backcasting where you start to look at a number of different scenarios, and you start to understand, at those future states, the people, the process, the governance, the solutions, the programs, the projects that will probably play out. But then you start stepping backwards to think about what needs to come before that future state. And you might choose a number of horizons closer to where you are today. Then you can start to see, okay, once you do that, and this is probably the toughest part of the futures work, because you're trying to meld like foresight and futures exploration with strategic rigor, right? And maybe some of that forecasting as well. And you're trying to just literally, what I tell my clients is, you're just trying to get some evidence that the world is going to be different, but evidence that you can act upon, right? So, for example, in energy, that renewable energy is going to be dominant in 30 years' time. So how do we step back from where we are today, and what are the steps between then and where we are today, and how can we make better decisions today and start to plan out, those next 5 to 10 years?
So if I'm speaking to engineers, I perhaps should call it reverse engineering from the future, what you call backcasting.
Well, exactly. You're reverse engineering, but what you're doing is that you're then trying to use sort of what's a fairly traditional approach of sort of strategic road mapping, but in a reverse sense. This was the most tricky chapter to try and capture, and to sort of explain what we need to do. And I've sort of lent on some really big thinkers in this area. But when we do go back and we start to see, even if it's really simple ideas about big questions that we have, at 5-year increments, that can be incredibly powerful, right? And we're starting to see that a lot of companies are starting to talk about futures in, their annual reports and whatever. So if you do futures work and you've got that, and then you've got a company that has redefined what their legacy is going to be from like 50, 100 years into the future, back on today, then it gets really interesting, right? Shareholders get excited and whatever. Elon Musk is kind of one of those guys that, with Tesla as an energy company and solar, and then SpaceX as a commercial rocket company, he was talking about that a good 10, 20, even 19 years ahead of when things were starting to happen. And you were like, whoa, landing rockets, for example. It's like, and no one else was doing it. And it took a perspective. And then all he did was, right, we need to do that. How do you work your way back? It's the same with futures, whether it's agriculture, whether it's, a company that operates in software, or, consumer engagement or content, the metaverse, Nick, it's like these interesting things. It's like, where do we go back? In fact, Mark Zuckerberg and the whole meta rebrand and metaverse idea is that he's done futures work to say speculatively we're going to be living in this online offline world, and all the videos are fancy. It's great speculative fiction, but all the shareholders are sort of balking at the idea that he's saying, you know what, it's going to be 10, 15 years of hard work and nonstop investment to even get close to that idea. And everyone's like getting all scared because suddenly they're not going to get a return on their investment in the next 1.3 years, right? And this is it. So it's kind of really, really interesting. So there's a little bit of backcasting going on there. But yeah, it's really tricky backcasting. But then back to strategic planning, because simply we've got a goal. There are objectives that help us reach that goal. There are strategies that feed into the objectives, and we measure the tactical executions that go underneath them, and we measure everything and we progress forward. But like, great for 6, 12, 18, 36 months. We can't do that with futures work. But what we can do is say, the next 36 months, we're going to achieve X, Y, and Z with an eye on 20 years' time, this bigger idea about what we're going to achieve, and knowing that in 10 years' time, we need to maybe hit these bigger goals that have sort of help us rethink how we establish our infrastructure or our strategic planning, or the way that we message around what our business does, right? So it gets really esoteric. It was a really tough part of the book to write, but that's what I try and work with clients, and it's probably the longest part of the process. Like, when you sit down, I worked with a city in North America just before Christmas. It's like, well, what do we do now? It's like, well, we take this and we use them as reference points. It's like, okay, it's like the futures work doesn't stop. We haven't finished the futures work. In fact, looking at, say, pedestrianized streets and automated vehicles, we've explored it, but our research hasn't stopped. So we need to start considering policies and effects, and we need to continue that work as well. So it's really important to continue the futures work, continue strategic planning, but the backcasting is that thread between them that suddenly provides some useful reference points coming back.
All right, Nick. So that was backcasting, but what about
Yeah.
futures consciousness? That's, I think, the last chapter of your book. So why is that? What is it, and why is that important?
So when we start, I mean, it's simple to say shifting a mindset to wonder what if and to be curious. But I think that when you're starting to think about building a capability in a business, you have to have people thinking the right way. You have to have people very aware of a situation. And I looked to some researchers that came up with a fairly extensive list of what makes someone that is conscious about our futures, right? And I've just got it here, right? So everything from like self-growth and the skill and love of thinking in multiple modes of understanding, expansive temporal consciousness, it gets very deep, deep purpose and tenacity, creativity and the adventuresome spirit. It's kind of, again, it gets quite spiritual in a way, Nick, to come back to ignite our imaginations, to be conscious and to be, have purpose in what we do on a daily basis, but also have a level of self-awareness, self-control and responsibility, not only to yourself, but to your community, to your company, and to the people that you serve as well. And a level of balance and temperance, to really work out, what we're doing is important. Well, what we're doing, we might just be providing the best cheeseburger in New York City, right? It could be as simple as that. But to have a company that's got a level of consciousness around it and a slightly bigger picture of what comes next is as important as just undertaking special futures projects or whatever. It's like when people talk about innovation. Innovation doesn't live in innovation rooms with innovation teams. It lives in the heart and drive of every single person in the organization, right? Where someone can come up with an idea that is literally $1 million idea. With futures, it's about people really seeking out something bigger than themselves and what the company is doing today, and really believing that as an individual they've got a role, and as a part of an organization and the dynamics that they play within that they've got a role as well.
Yeah, for me, what I took from that chapter, to put it in one sentence and sum it up, is that futures consciousness is understanding that imagination is our superpower. We touched upon that.
Yeah.
And that breaks down, if you have that kind of imagination as a superpower, it breaks down any wall. So that's what I took most out of that, and of course you go into a lot more into it, but that's what I took down, and I think that's a very powerful takeaway. So Nick, we've been talking now for a long time here, and unfortunately we have to bring our conversation to a close. Let me ask you the traditional two last questions that I always ask of my guest. First one is, where can people find more about you and your work?
I'm all over the internet, so you can type in Nikolas Badminton. You'll find me on YouTube and LinkedIn, and a little bit on Twitter these days, though not as much. I run Futurist.com and the think tank there. You can find me there. You can also find me at NikolasBadminton.com. You can buy the book Facing Our Futures from good independent booksellers first. And if you really want to, you can buy it from Amazon as well. So, I'm everywhere, and I try and connect with people as much as I can. And if you're listening to this podcast, don't be afraid to email me, like Nicholas@futurist.com, or link with me in LinkedIn. I like to have conversations about more than just booking me for a talk or doing a gig. I like to hear new ideas from people out there, or jump on phone calls with people that are doing industrial design at university that want to discuss agricultural futures. I just did that with someone from Chicago earlier this week, or people that are creatives that are suddenly trying to expand their own mind. So the door's open, and I think that's really important. So futurist.com, nicholasbadminton.com. You can Google my name.
So Nikolas Futurist, Nikolas Badminton. What's the final message? What's the one thing that you want people to take away from our conversation here today?
We can have hope, but that hope is nothing without imagination. And we also need to realize that nostalgia is the greatest threat to good futures thinking. So we need to somewhat shake off our history and look towards the horizons with love and hope and positivity. And we need to not be afraid to understand that some bad things may come, and to explore what they look like so we can prepare for them as well.
Wow, nostalgia is the great threat to our futures thinking. Nick Badminton, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thanks, Nick. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.